This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Alethia Kasben.
And I'm Zach Gorchow.
That's right. We've got a special MichMash opener. The stars, and by stars, I mean our very busy calendars have aligned, and the three of us get to chat this week, which is very exciting. And we're discussing a couple of things, mainly Donald Trump's first 100 days in office, and this week's announcement that the Selfridge Air Base would be getting 21 very specific types of fighter jets. Guys, I sometimes like to see my role on this show as the audience surrogate. So let me ask you two, what's the big deal with Selfridge? Zach, I feel a history lesson coming on.
So you are right. More than 100 years ago, part of the United States effort in World War I, yes, World War I, involved establishing an airfield in what was then a swamp near Mount Clemens. Remember, most of our fair state was nothing more than a swamp for most of its existence, in Macomb County, where some of the very first U.S. Army aviation units trained. Through the years, its purpose evolved. The famed Tuskegee Airmen trained there. It was known through the 1960s as a place where some of the most elite aviators in the military trained. And then in 1971, the U.S. Air Force transferred it to the Michigan Air National Guard, and ever since, it's been home to various military units.
Right, so this is a huge employer with about 3,000 employees. It's a big point of pride for the state, which lost its Air Force bases in the post-Cold War defense reductions in the 1990s. And there have long been worries about whether Selfridge would meet the same fate as the old Wordsmith base in Escoda, the K.I. Sawyer base in Marquette, which were both deemed unnecessary and shuttered. Michigan leaders have long argued its strategic value near the U.S.-Canada border and for years have urged the federal government to assign a new mission to the base to keep it viable. They want to keep all those jobs and economic activity there. That's what President Trump agreed to do this week in announcing 20 F-15EX jets that would be assigned there.
It probably doesn't hurt that the base is in Macomb County. Now that we're sort of all caught up on the history lesson, one of the most famously politically competitive bellwether counties in the entire country, right?
Cheyna, are you suggesting politics might have played a role here? I'm shocked.
I would never insinuate it, but since you brought it up, yes.
Yes, there is no question Macomb's unique politics helps. It's a county that, of course, backed Trump twice, and it also backed Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer twice, the times they're all on the ballot. It's got a bevy of Democratic and Republican elected officials in key positions.
It's worth pointing out, though, that this still took some time. Michigan has been asking for a new mission at Selfridge for years. It saw some significant cutbacks during the Obama administration, during the first Trump administration. Then Governor Snyder, followed by Governor Whitmer and others, sought to have the base host the F-35 fighters and were not successful. Whitmer has continued these efforts along with lawmakers in the state and in Congress into the Biden administration, and that didn't work out either.
Okay, now that we've concluded the Top Gun portion of our program,
I feel the need for speed.
Let's talk about the politics of this event. And let's start with the Governor Whitmer of it all. Zach, why was everybody sort of on pins and needles in anticipation of this event, just wanting to see if Governor Whitmer even showed up at the airport to greet President Trump?
So it was only a few weeks ago, folks will remember, that the governor was at the White House for what she thought would be a small private meeting with the president and some key people. And it turned into her being walked into an Oval Office news conference on live national television. There were some really, you could call them unfortunate, you could call them amusing, you could call them any number of things, photos of the governor in the Oval Office where she was clearly unhappy to be there and having her picture taken. So with that as sort of the backdrop and the national criticism she took over that, here we were going to have these two one-time bitter antagonists again in close proximity to each other, this time on Whitmer's home turf of the state of Michigan. And everyone was wondering how this would go.
President Trump was here this week for a rally that was later in the evening. And then it sort of came out during the day that Whitmer was going to be at Selfridge and Trump was going to be at Selfridge. So I think what this shows is Whitmer, kind of turning, the hiding your face behind the folder moment into a tangible win that now she can point to. Like, look, this was all worth it. I think she said as much in a couple of interviews, like the grief was worth it. But it was still really interesting because, again, you have the Democratic governor with Republican state legislative leaders greeting the Republican president as he lands. And then you still had the president praising Governor Whitmer again in front of a crowd of military people. Like, it's just incredible that he, was here for a rally to boast, his first 100 days, most of which the Democratic governor does not agree with. And an hour before it, he's talking about, what a good job Governor Whitmer has done, while Senator Aric Nesbitt and House Speaker Matt Hall are standing in the background.
And what has been the reaction both to how Governor Whitmer has handled the event this week, or I guess events? There's the airport arrival and then there's the rally, as well as how has Trump and his administration what has been the response on both sides to these events?
I mean, you have a lot of different responses. I would say among the national left, it's horror that Gretchen Whitmer, I don't know if I'd call it a hug, but there was sort of a greeting embrace on the tarmac where the president landed. That again, from the left's point of view, the president is the worst and they want him out of office. He shouldn't be there. He's, tearing up the Constitution is the criticism from the left. And here you have Governor Gretchen Whitmer, a Democrat, working with the president and saying nice things about the job he's doing. Among what I would describe as more the centrist Democrats, I think this is this is what you're supposed to do when you're the governor of a state. You're supposed to work with the president, even when you may have enormous differences politically. If you can work with the president to secure something like Selfridge and its future, you do it. For the Republicans, it's sort of almost man behind the curtain kind of thing where they're like, Trump is the greatest. This is happening because of Trump and Trump only. And we'll just pretend we're not hearing him say these nice things about Governor Whitmer, whom we have spent years, just trashing publicly. It's just really interesting to watch.
And I think there's this perception for the governor that at best, these instances with the president will make messaging difficult if she decides to run for president in 2028, and at worst will make it impossible for her to get through a Democratic primary. So that'll be interesting to watch moving forward. Do these images just stack up against her and there's just no way for her to come out of a Democratic primary as the Trump-friendly candidate?
I saw one pretty popular left-wing commentator on Twitter/X yesterday, drawing the comparison to the Chris Christie, governor of New Jersey at the time, and President Obama hug in the wake of the Hurricane Sandy response. And that was widely attributed as damaging Chris Christie's prospects of getting a Republican nomination because he was being nice to the Democratic president. And that comparison was made. I don't know if that's particularly valid, but look, in today's day and age, everything and anything will be used against you.
I want to talk about some of the other people that were there. So Trump had asked the congressional delegation to stay in D.C. in order for them to take care of some votes, which put John James in a bind, though he did later show up at the rally. And the one that seemed to really get a decent amount of FaceTime, or at least be in the aura of Trump during this, was Aric Nesbitt. He was there with the receiving party at the airport and among a small group standing alongside Trump at the base. And you guys actually spoke with Senator Nesbitt, and this is what he had to say about that experience.
I look at it that having President Trump come to Michigan to celebrate his first 100 days shows the importance of Michigan, how much he cares about Michigan. And what we've seen over the last 50 years in Michigan is a hollowing out of our urban centers. You see it in Detroit, you see it in Saginaw, you see it in Pontiac, you see it across their shadows of themselves. And President Trump cares about putting back manufacturing first and working to bring back those supply chains in the United States. And we got to be able here in Michigan to be able to compete and win for those investments.
So what did you guys make of who was there, alongside Trump, and most notably maybe even who wasn't there?
So I think what was most interesting and sort of looking ahead to 2026 is, Congressman John James was there and he is running for governor. He was at the rally, like you said, that was later in the evening. And Senator Nesbitt, also a Republican running for governor, was among the group that greeted the president at the tarmac at the Selfridge base. So there were two events that both of them went to. So Nesbitt, got some FaceTime. Maybe that's a positive for him. John James got a shout out during the rally. No endorsements were made by the president of either Republican, which would have been a huge surprise, I should note, if that had happened, but it definitely did not. And they both got at least some sort of FaceTime with the president. So I don't know what that says about, what the president is thinking, if he is going to endorse in this race, which has been, it's going to be a competitive primary. I think a lot of Republicans would probably like for him to let that play out. But clearly they are jockeying for time, for comments. They want to be seen at Trump events at the very least.
Yeah, I think this was a nice moment for Senator Nesbitt. I mean, everybody knows that Congressman James and the president have been pretty tight as these things go. The president, of course, gave James a call out at that Oval Office news conference I mentioned earlier with regards to Selfridge, but we've never really seen any signs of what does President Trump think of Aric Nesbitt, or does he even know who Aric Nesbitt is? And here, Nesbitt got to be in the receiving line on the tarmac, and he got to be up there, right next to the president as the remarks were happening. And so I think if you're Senator Nesbitt, and the main thing you want is right now for the president to stay out of it. No quick endorsement of James, because there's a lot of wonderings about what that'll happen. But now he can go to people and say, here's some tangible proof. Yes, the president takes me seriously. I'm somebody he trusts, because up until now, really only John James had that. So we can tend to make mountains out of a molehill, and I'm probably doing that now. But I think this was a useful, helpful moment for Nesbitt.
We're going to take a short break here, but when we come back, we're switching gears and continuing our effort to talk with all the candidates for the major spots in the 2026 election. Alethia and Zach, you spoke with Republican gubernatorial candidate Aric Nesbitt. You can hear that whole conversation right after this.
Welcome back to MichMash. We are joined now by Senator Aric Nesbitt, the Senate Minority Leader and Republican candidate for governor. Senator Nesbitt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So, Senator, you were, of course, the first Republican to jump into the race for governor. Why did you launch your campaign somewhat early, and do you feel like that has worked out well? You had the field to yourself for a while.
You can just call me Aric, so no
Okay.
formalities here. It's okay.
What was with you Southwest Michigan Republicans? Fred Upton was always Fred. You want to go with Aric? We can make that happen.
No, it's something we're growing up on a sixth generation during grape farm, middle of 5 kids. There was, whenever you're at the dinner table, there's never much respect for names and everything. And at the end of the day, in political office, you just have the good name to keep it when you leave, and that's the important thing to remember. Is as much as we get passionate about the issues and policies of the day, I have the third born that's about a month old now, and it really takes you back to remember and understand what's important in life in terms of the family, in terms of the community, in terms of what's around you. And so, as I looked at running for governor, I looked around the state and I saw there hasn't been a seriousness over the last 6 years on moving policy that impacts our state forward. I think we expect so much better out of Lansing than what we're getting today. And that's why I decided to launch early, because what President Trump showed us last year, Michigan's a big, diverse state. And if you're going to connect with folks across the state, from Ironwood to Monroe, from Alpena to New Buffalo, there's a lot of diversity in terms of connecting with folks. And I thought it was very important, if we're going to push for an agenda that includes Michigan students first, such as providing accountability and choice for our schools, Michigan families first, instead of these, 70 pronouns in schools and going against the, traditional family. And you've got to empower the families to give some school choice and to provide, allowing families to raise their kids as they see fit. And a Michigan Workers First agenda where instead of this billions of dollars in corporate welfare, that we're actually concentrating on fixing our roads and putting our workers first.
So since your campaign launch, U.S. Rep. John James and former Attorney General Mike Cox have both entered the Republican primary. What makes you stand out as the strongest candidate, both, in this Republican primary, but then, in the general against a Democrat?
Yeah, it's about solving Michigan's problems. It's about as I look at it, going into next year, you got to have somebody who's strong and able to win statewide. And I've shown over the years can win. I've won every election I've been in. And it's something where over the experience that I've had is that I can bring to the table is that I know on day one what to do and on day 100 what to do when in office and push through the legislative agenda that's needed. I've been shown to be able to get big legislative items through the legislature, been able to understand that at the executive level, if you're going to actually push the necessary changes. I mean, you look at the governor a few weeks ago at her State of the State address. It was 2 months ago. She talked about how horrible permitting was in the state. She's been governor for 6 years. 6 years. And she's talking about how bad her department heads are doing with permitting. I mean, it's like an arsonist that finally caused the fire department the day after the fire. It's ridiculous. And that's the same thing. Remember 2 years ago, she was all hyped up on this population commission report, right? And then it rolled out in December after she got it done, and it was a damning indictment of her first 5 years in office. Our roads are in poor condition. Permitting's not happening. Education is weak. I mean, 3 out of 4 fourth graders aren't reading at grade level. Only 2 years ago, the Democratic trifecta goes ahead and repeals third grade reading requirements. And then they repeal requirements on simple letter grades for schools. Let's just get back to basics. And this is the point, is that there's going to be probably a lot of folks that get into different races. Everything's up next year. But if we do nothing, if we just keep the status quo here in Lansing, operating the way it's been, Michigan's going to be a poorer state, a less educated state with a lot less people. State demographers figure if status quo happens, the next 30 years, we could lose up to 700,000 people net in the state. That's not acceptable. And that's something where at the end of the day, you got to have the understanding of the policies to push forward, that it's just back to basics. A good tax environment, a good regulatory environment, a good permitting environment, a good education, good infrastructure, competitive energy. I mean, a year and a half ago, the Democrats passed this Green New Scam that's industrializing 300,000 acres of farm and forest land in our state and abolishing fossil fuels. How does industrializing that much farm and forest land help the environment? It doesn't. It helps a bunch of billionaires out in San Francisco, not the workers here in Michigan and not the farmers here either, because the farmers, it's going to become tougher and tougher to pass on that land to the next generation.
So we got sort of a two-part follow-up to this. First is, there's no question you've been involved in some of the major legislative heavy lifts of the last 10 to 15 years, auto insurance, I always forget the year, if it was 2016 or 17. I know you'll remember the energy bill of that year. You have been involved in crafting and building and negotiating these big types of things, but typically voters don't get animated by that. They don't oh, you were part of the system. They want to hear the sort of I'm going to break a few eggs, that kind of stuff. I guess you're just sort of talking about that, but how do you get past that? The idea that surely your opponents are going to say, well, Aric Nesbitt, he's been part of Lansing. He's an insider. He's close with, X, Y, and Z influences there. How do you overcome that and not be seen as the insider candidate?
I'm just a farm boy fighting the liberals in Lansing, and that's what I'm going to continue to do. I'm somebody who grew up in a 6th-generation dairy and grape farm, middle of 5 kids, worked my way through college, went to Hillsdale College with my degree in economics. Somebody that thought it was important and knows it important if you want to have a pro-family, pro-business, pro-individual state that can compete and win in the 21st century. You got to have folks that are willing to step up and change the system. And as I look at it coming up into next year, is that it's all on the table. In 2010, in the first decade of this century, we were one of only 2 states to lose population. We're number 50th when we should have been 1 in some of these statistics. We're number 1 where we should have been 50th. And you go down the list: unemployment, budget deficits, economic growth, number of people, young people leaving the state. And we made a lot of good changes. Became a right-to-work state, repealed 2,200 rules and regulations, eliminated the old Michigan business tax, eliminated tens of billions of dollars of unfunded liability. But the last 5 years, since the lockdowns of COVID and the lockdowns of education with one-person rule, it matters who the executive is. It matters how you drive the change in policy. And it's something where there'll probably be a lot more flashpoints from different members or other folks, but I'm going to put together, I'm working around the state, I'm going to put together a campaign that's going to put Michigan first, and a campaign that's going to offer positive, conservative solutions to fix some of the deepest problems in Michigan. And people that know me know that I have the work ethic to get it done, know that I have the philosophical bona fides to get it done, whether I've been in the majority or the minority. You look at, or whether I've been in leadership or not, you look at my record on corporate welfare, it's second to none. Been consistent. I haven't changed. The problem is that the Democrat trifecta that we've had the last 2 years, and this governor has been more willing to go ahead and sell the state out to some of the biggest left-wing progressive folks around this country instead of working for the people of Michigan. And that's something where, as I start early, as I've been having connections around the state, I've been really impressed by the turnout, both at the grassroots level of somebody that has a philosophical, conservative understanding and philosophy, and also from the donor community that understands I know how to get things done. And that's something where I'm going to continue to build over the next year and a half to make sure we have the strongest Republican candidate to win this state back. And not just the governor, but the Secretary of State, Attorney General, State Senate, and State House, if we're going to make the changes that are necessary in the state to compete and win in the 21st century.
So looking ahead to 2026 and the potential political environment, then, we know that during President Trump's first term, the midterm elections were fairly positive for Democrats. Are you concerned about that in 2026? And do you think the gubernatorial race in Michigan can be somewhat shielded from potential headwinds from Washington?
There's a lot of political prognosticators. I suppose you two are some of them.
I think you're one too.
Guilty as charged. You like to be one.
And trying to predict and provide stuff. But let me tell you something, is at the end of the day, what you see with the voters on Michigan, and what I've seen over the years, is that Michigan workers and families and small business owners and farmers and law enforcement, they want somebody that actually provides a positive vision and agenda for the state of Michigan. And on education, on infrastructure, on business development, I'm working on all those areas to show that I'm going to be the solutions-oriented, conservative solutions-oriented candidate. I mean, why? And that's something where, as you get things done, providing that positive vision that Michigan can compete and win in the 21st century. Law enforcement, I got your back. Small business owners, I got your back. Students, I got your back. Families, I got your back. Showing that we're going to put in what's needed to compete and win, I think is something where voters respond to. And leaving a lot of this sniping and negativity, it is what it is. They want somebody that's willing to govern and change the state to a better direction.
So we just talked about prognosticators. So we'll get into some of that typically failed conventional wisdom here, which is John James, of course, 2 statewide runs for office. He's run for Congress twice in the Metro Detroit media market. There's been $11 gajillion spent on his behalf going back to 2018. His name ID is through the roof. What do you say to the idea that he's the front runner simply because he is the most well-known of the field so far?
Well, at the end of the day, anything in polling right now is name ID. And so this is why we started early. This is why we're building up that Michigan First agenda. This is why I'm working to connect with voters in all 83 counties around the state. And it's something where I'm going to be concentrating on showing that I'm going to be able to get the things done and the vision done to grow the state, to make sure Michigan's as successful as possible. And at the end of the day, whoever else gets in, I can't control that. What I can control is who I talk to, what I do every day, and how do I win the day every day.
So President Trump was in Michigan this week, and you were able to greet him at the tarmac when he arrived at the Selfridge base. You know, he again said that Governor Whitmer is doing a good job during his remarks there. You know, what do you make of that?
Well, I think it's something where it's good to see that a governor and President Trump, that 5 years ago, this governor was trying to tear down and destroy at every point possible, to see that she's actually starting to work with the Trump administration, I can appreciate. And it's something where it's already yielded some success here for Michigan, such as the Selfridge Air Force Base and Air National Guard Base and the new mission that's there. I think people, as we look at it, I think people expect leaders to be able to work to get things done. And believe me, I'm not going to agree with the governor, neither is President Trump going to agree with the governor on things like, men competing in women's sports. She seems to support that, and we're opposed to that. Or having all this money spent on DEI initiatives. Like, I'm going to actively oppose any of that, and so is President Trump. But as I look at it, that having President Trump come to Michigan to celebrate his first 100 days shows the importance of Michigan, how much he cares about Michigan, and what we've seen over the last 50 years in Michigan is a hollowing out of our urban centers. You see it in Detroit, you see it in Saginaw, you see it in Pontiac, you see it across the shadows of themselves. And President Trump cares about putting back manufacturing first and working to bring back those supply chains in the United States. And we got to be able here in Michigan to be able to compete and win for those investments. And I'm afraid with what Governor Whitmer and the Democrat majorities in the last few years have done in Michigan, haven't put us in that position to compete and win in a lot of these investments that we're seeing coming into the United States of America. And we got to get better. We got to get more efficient. We got to lower our tax rates. We got to fix our infrastructure. We got to get better accountability and back to basics in our schools. We just got to get back to basics. And instead, what we've seen from this governor is saying we're just going to bribe companies to come here and write billion-dollar checks because of in jobs that haven't been showing up yet.
I'm glad you raised that, because this seems to be a conundrum that has faced Michigan governors going back forever. John Engler became governor, dismantled a lot of these sort of corporate welfare or incentive programs. Then he created MEGA because he felt the state had unilaterally disarmed. Other states, including Republican states, Democratic states, were throwing a lot of money around. Jennifer Granholm came in and sort of turbocharged that. Rick Snyder came in at the same time you did, took that all down and sort of started to build it back. And then Whitmer now has really turbocharged it. But, I hear about states like Tennessee, Kentucky, they're throwing billions of dollars around too. How does the state compete when all these other states are doing the same thing?
So Upjohn Institute did a study a few years ago, and they said 80% of these major economic development programs were going to end up in the communities that they were going into with or without the incentives. So it's really 1 in 5 that depend on it. And the question is, are you going to do economic growth by press release? Or are you going to do economic growth by getting back to the basics on making sure you have a good regulatory environment, a good tax environment, a good education environment, good infrastructure environment? In Tennessee, 0% income tax state. If you're, it's tough to compete with that way, right? Easy permitting, turnkey permitting. You look at a state a little closer like Indiana, just look at the results the last 20 years, 25 years. They've grown by about 800,000 people. We've grown a net about 40,000. Lost folks in the first decade, gained folks in the second decade, going to start losing folks again. You're seeing that with outbound population. The way I put it is that over the last, I think Governor Snyder put it as economic gardening. right? That was the initial thing. Like, we got to get back to the basics. And that's something where if you don't get back to the basics on tax, on education, on infrastructure, on permitting, then you can't even be on the list. And you know this, not being a right to work state, repealing that, you're just not even on the list on some of these manufacturing investments anymore. Doesn't even matter what your incentives are. And so if you're serious, if you're serious about competing, I guess the best way to put it is like, you got to bake the cake first and having those basics down. And then if you put some frosting on top, those are probably the incentives, but you got to have the basic foundation first. And we don't have that basic foundation. And this governor's been really working off the base of doing economic development by public relations. I have examples. So example, Southwest Michigan, Cass County, new aluminum plant, recycling plant coming in, not a dime of state money, $140 million investment, 70 new jobs, 20 miles away from the Indiana border. May not sound big to some of your listeners, but in rural Cass County with less than 50,000 people, that's a big investment.
Sure.
Right? Did a groundbreaking. 10 weeks later, I get a call from the person doing the industrial park development saying, I need help, can't get a permit. Oh, what permit? Curb cut, MDOT. I call up MEDC. Oh, that's an MDOT issue. Well, I thought you guys were all part of Team Michigan. What happened? Right? Took me 10 days of going back and forth with the director of MDOT to get a freaking curb cut from M60 outside of Cassopolis. This isn't some 30,000 cars a day highway, right? And it was because we didn't know who was going to own the sidewalk. Well, one, it's Michigan. Everybody's going to drive there. They're probably not going to walk. And with the way we have lack of investment in infrastructure, that sidewalk's probably not going to be taken care of. Tierra Yachts in Holland right now, 750 employees. It's 95% of the goods they manufacture, they sell outside this state. They have a dock on Lake Makatawa, stationary dock. They want to expand it from 5 foot wide to 10 foot wide, have it a floating dock. They're 3 years, $1.3 million of costs, legal and engineering costs in, because Eagle won't give them a permit. And I hear that in Muskegon. I hear this in Monroe. I hear this in Macomb. I hear this in Pontiac. I hear this across the state, that the issues from these bureaucrats in Lansing on whether it's permitting or whether the politicization of MEDC, it's so political. A lot of these folks have to hire lobbyists here in town to go ahead and try to guide them instead of saying, this is how you qualify and work through. I think you got to start all over. You got to fix the basics. And then at some point, if there's a little sugar on top, well, if it's infrastructure, if it's workforce training, if it's water and water and sewer extensions, I think people can accept that. Or how do you work on, instead of all these green fields taking up more of our farmland, how do you work to make sure that 300 acres west side of Lansing is actually ready to be developed, right? So we have so many brownfields with millions of square feet that we got to get ready to redevelop. And what did the Senate Democrats do in December? They passed a bill that'd make it near impossible. Again, fortunately, the House, with Leader Hall's exit and Representative Whitsett's courage, walked off, the House floor and made sure that none of this happened. But what the Senate Democrats passed in December would have made sure that there wouldn't be another brownfield or urban redevelopment site in the state of Michigan. Policies matter. Policies have an effect. And are we willing to compete and win in the 21st century? Or are we just going to say status quo is going to happen? I'm not willing to do that with my children, my next generation. How do we have that 6th generation farm go to the 7th generation? My family's been in Michigan for 7 generations and came over 200 years ago. And we want to make sure that Michigan's the best place to raise a family, to invest and grow a business, to retire in. Believe me, you compare to Indiana, they don't have the parks, the lakes, the beautiful natural resources we have, but they have better policies. And we got to compete and win on those better policies.
So moving to sort of another really important policy area in the state, energy, one that I know you're very familiar with. You have been a very significant figure in sort of the rewrite of the energy law many years ago. to keep DTE and consumers as like the key providers in the state. You know,
But you didn't read the energy law then. I mean, not to be offensive. It's just it's this is what happened. A little energy story.
I knew you were going to take me to task.
Yeah, I'm
like, do I really want to ask this question?
Yeah. But you look at energy in Michigan, and a lot of people when they think of energy, you know, they think of different things. But what you're referring to is electricity, the electricity distribution network that's there. Some people think of gas, something, you know, natural gas or other things. But you look at it in 2007 and 8. What did the state do? They passed an energy law that put together mandates and requirements and increased costs in 2007 and 2008. And at the same time, what was happening in 2007 and 2008 and 2009? We lost 20% of our base load for manufacturing in Michigan. And we required a 10% build out of renewables at the same time. And what happened to prices? They went up, right? The driving point of 2016 was, one, make sure we had the capacity to make sure we had the generating capacity. We scrapped the old mandates and requirements on these renewables and on some of these other energy mandates. And we said, let's put them all in a basket. Let's do an integrated resource plan where we say, what is the most cost-efficient, reliable method of producing energy and delivering that energy to the customers around the state? And they had to file an integrated resource plan. We took away some of that, you know, where before they could increase rates before they went to the commission, and then they could true up. We took away some of that stuff. But at the end of the day, the whole goal of that was to make sure we had the generating capacity and to make sure there was a diversity without the mandates. And unfortunately, because of the energy law in 2007 and 8 that got passed, that we're continuing to pay some of those highest rates because of the purchase power agreements that they went in for this wind and solar we didn't need at the time because we were long on energy. We're getting to the point because of the closure of our coal plants and because of what happened with the Green New Energy scam that was passed by the Democrats a year and a half ago. If something doesn't change in the coming 3 years, we're going to start getting short we're going to start getting short on electricity.
There's not a lot of room to your right. You're obviously a very conservative guy, but the free marketers were pushing for like deregulating the market. And you definitely said that, no, I don't support that. What could you ever envision a scenario where it would be good policy to deregulate the electric market and just let the alternative suppliers compete as much as they want?
Well, it's not deregulation of the electric, it's a retail choice of it.
Sure.
And the highest rates in the nation are those retail choice markets in the New England states. And the lowest cost in the nation are those that have hydroelectric. If you're looking at cost, it's those that are in where the generating source is coming from. And that's your hydroelectric from Idaho or Washington or Tennessee, or it's from those coal states that can shovel the coal right out of the mine. And so at the end of the day, it's not the type of retail choice or regulated market, it's how it's where the use coming from. And I think people expect at the end of the day, like on natural gas where you can store it and there is full retail choice on it because you can store it. There could be a day sometime when you are able to actually have good storage on energy to be able to get into some more innovative ways of delivering that energy. But as I look at around the country, if we want reliable, lower cost energy, it's about the reliability is more on the distribution side and making sure you have the generating capacity, and the cost is about where the energy is actually coming from. And and right now the low cost producer is natural gas. And if we're serious about cost and reliability on the generating side, then what the House did yesterday was important on repealing these requirements on the renewables, on phasing out all fossil fuels. And that's what the Democrats did a year and a half ago.
So we're going to keep switching around here. I want to go back to President Trump. Were you able to speak with him at the event this week? And how important of a figure do you think he will be in this gubernatorial primary?
Well, President Trump's a transformational figure in American government. And it's something where over the last 10 years with his involvement in the America First movement that we've seen over the last decade that President Trump's been leading, is that how do we get back to common sense? And I think that's the biggest draw from last year. Is I talked to a buddy of mine went to high school with, and he's a union guy. Pretty sure he voted for Kamala Harris. I mean, he's a Democrat. And he asked me the day after the election, "Do you think my party learned anything?" I'm like, I don't think so. I think I think the Democrats think it was all about messaging instead of actual policies. And his response to me was like, "I think you're right." One is I think there was an authenticity issue with Kamala Harris last year that, wish she would have went on Joe Rogan, but I don't know how she would have seemed authentic over a 2-hour podcast. Two is that inflation's just crushing us, and saying that it wasn't put on by all this government debt and government spending is kind of insane. It's just common sense to take responsibility for some of that and admit that it's actually happening. Kamala never did. Just knowing who's crossing your border is pretty common sense, and yet we've had open border policies. And I have 2 middle school kids, and they in a small town, and they saw people smoking crack with impunity. Now I hope that we can bring down some costs, get the economy moving with some deregulations without destroying the environment. And so this is from a Democrat the day after the election. And 100 days in now is that President Trump's been following through on his promises that are there on energy, on immigration, on inflation. And it's something where this president, in terms of the movement that he started and has created and is continuing to push forward, is going to be a very important figure in the coming years to come.
All right, Senator Nesbitt, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for you guys covering some of the important issues that are there and doing it in a manner. And one of these long form formats is trying to dive a little deeper than what we've seen in the past.
Absolutely. Thank you.